And now to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith lecture series here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we are presenting the theme, Religion and Statecraft, the Soft Power of Global Peacemaking. Our distinguished guest today is Dr. Larry Greenfield. Larry L. Greenfield is Executive Director of the Parliament of the World's Religions, the largest and most historic convening organization of the Interfaith movement, headquartered in Chicago, Illinois. Born and raised in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, he received his BA degree from Sioux Falls College and his BD, MA, and PhD in theology from the University of Chicago Divinity School, where he subsequently taught and served as Dean of Students. Larry was my Dean of Students at Chicago during those years in the early 80s. He later served as president of Colgate-Rochester Divinity School, Bexley Hall, Crozer Theological Seminary in Rochester, New York, where he also brought the Roman Catholic St. Bernard's Institute to the campus. There again, our paths met as Larry hired me to the faculty at Colgate-Rochester after I'd completed my PhD at Chicago. He served as vice president for research at the Park Ridge Center for the Study of Health, Faith, and Ethics in Chicago, where his own research focused on multi-faith understandings of sexuality, science, and civil discourse. He was the theologian in residence at Protestants for the Common Good, writing a bi-weekly column on thinking theologically about the common good that focused on relating religion to domestic and foreign affairs. He has also served pastorates and campus ministries in Chicago and Ann Arbor, and more recently was the executive minister of the American Baptist Churches of Metro Chicago. He's the co-founder and currently chairperson of the board of directors of the Religious Institute on Sexual Morality, Justice, and Healing. He's an ordained clergy person in the American Baptist Churches USA and past president of the American Theological Society Midwest. He serves on the boards of numerous ecumenical and interfaith organizations and chairs the board of trustees of the Baptist Theological Union of the University of Chicago Divinity School. Larry is married to Barbara Greenfield. They have 2 adult daughters, 5 grandchildren, and 1 great-grandchild. And the Greenfields have homes in Chicago and Rochester. Barbara Greenfield's here on the porch of the Hall of Missions. Barbara, if you'd stand and wave, we are delighted to welcome you to Chautauqua. Larry and I's lives have intersected and intertwined over the years, as I've alluded to it, and he is, of course, a diehard Chicago Bears fan, which I suppose is the reason we see the colors he wears today. The title of his presentation is The Reformation of Statecraft and the Craft of Religion, Reassessing and Realigning Power for a Global Community. We're very grateful to the Carnahan-Jackson Religious Lectureship for providing support for today's Interfaith lecture. We're delighted that Larry can be with us today, and so now I ask you to join me in providing a very warm Chautauqua welcome to Larry Greenfield.
Were you counting? My batting average here was pretty good, according to what Robert told you. I failed the first time I tried to get him to join me. That is when he was looking for a place to do his MDiv degree. He went to some second-rate place in the Boston area. But I was more successful when we made the case for his doing his MA and PhD at Chicago. And then, based on what I saw there, I welcomed him as a faculty member in Rochester. Every place I've gone, I've appreciated the wisdom and the charm and the elegance of Robert Franklin. So speaking of Chicago, I wrote a dissertation on the early Chicago school, and that involved William Randy Harper and Gerald Burney Smith and Shaler Matthews. And in all their writings, this was the place they talked about. this is the place they came. This was in the early 1900s. So I got to know Chautauqua before I ever set foot here. And I recognize what an amazing place it is. And I am honored to be here today to address this topic about the craft of religion and the craft of statecraft. To the year, a half millennium ago, certain crafts began to be reformed. That is, these particular crafts began to be restructured, reorganized, and reconfigured. Now, 500 years later, I want to argue it is urgent that this kind of reforming occur again. Not all crafts, mind you, just certain ones, certain crucial ones. What I have in mind for reforming are the crafts of politics and the crafts of religion. Whoa, you must be saying. That's far too much to take on. And what's this business about talking of politics and religions as crafts anyway? Now I can sympathize with those sentiments, for politics and religion are not small, incidental, and they certainly aren't manageable dimensions of life. Just the opposite, big and important and essential to human life. Not one confined to a few land masses on the earth, not to limited populations on the earth, but ones that have to do with all peoples, really all creatures, on the whole now what we know as an interdependent planet. But because the task of reformation for both politics and religion is so large, so significant, and even essential, the task is also necessarily inescapable. This reforming. As for thinking of these two important crafts, or these two important areas as crafts, I'm simply using that term statecraft and applying it now to religion. Got it? Just as we talk about statecraft, I'm going to talk about religion craft. Perhaps attending to a definition of terms will help. By craft, I mean a practice, a patterned action, a disciplined way of doing. Crafts can be done poorly or well, crudely or exquisitely, ineptly or skillfully. But craft itself has to do with a defined order. And I distinguish craft from art, which I understand to be essentially creative, in the sense of bringing something new into being, whether that new thing be an object or a product or a concept or a perspective or an understanding. As important as art may be, including in politics and religion, I am interested this afternoon in what is at stake in reforming the crafts, the practices, the disciplines of both politics and religion. Got it? That's the task. By politics, I mean the intentional ordering of human power to achieve defined civic and public ends. The craft of ordering the state, or what we commonly call statecraft. Appropriately, in many circumstances, we assign statecraft to the sphere of a civic entity's foreign or international relations, which I take it was the nature of the presentation this morning. Statecraft as in international or foreign affairs. But given what the term actually means, there's really no reason why it shouldn't apply as well to domestic affairs of a political entity, the administration of the state. Statecraft means the craft of governing, Again, the intentional order of human power to achieve defined civic or public ends. By religion, I mean the willful ordering of an individual human self or the human community in thought and behavior with reference to what is understood to be sacred or holy. The ordering of human life with reference to what is sacred or holy. Of what is understood to be divine, or if you will, what I'm going to call this afternoon, religion craft. Got it? Like statecraft, so the defining of religious life is religion craft. Now, to be sure, there are political activities going on internally in religions. Let me tell you, as a denominational executive, I know all about that. Struggles for attaining positions of leadership, issues of polity, processes for choosing the vision of a religious organization or how it carries out that vision. All that's a part, yes, of politics within religion. And there are religious dimensions internal to the sphere of politics, sometimes noble, I was going to say other times, but most of the time manipulative. But for the purpose of our discussion this afternoon, I'm treating statecraft and religion craft as separate spheres. Let me illustrate by referring all too briefly to that reformation that occurred a half millennium ago. Martin Luther's action in 1517 were not meant to create something new, as in art, but to renew what he had discovered in his study of the Bible about the practices of the Christian faith. And in this sense, he was exercising religion craft, not statecraft. This Augustinian monk and university lecturer saw that the ordering of faith by purchasing indulgences as a means of salvation and sustaining the financial viability of the church ran counter to the God of grace through faith that he found in the New Testament, especially in the letters of the Apostle Paul. But Luther's excommunication in 1521 sparked changes not just the way in which the Christian faith could be lived or practiced by those who followed Luther, but also by the way politics was configured and practiced in Europe, and then somewhat later in America. And then by virtue of the missionary movement and national colonialism around the world in the coming decades and centuries. So his impact was both in the craft of religion and in the craft of state. Other leaders took up the cause of reordering the beliefs and practices of the Christian faith in different ways than Luther, and had different and decisive consequences for the reordering of political life at that time and in the future. Think of John Calvin or Zwingli as examples of different ways of ordering the Christian life other than Roman Catholicism. It is not an overstatement to claim that what Luther started with his 95 Theses in response to the practice of faith changed things, reformed things, sometimes for great good, and let us acknowledge sometimes for great evil, in fundamental ways across the globe for both religion and politics. And it's worth noting, if only in brief reference, that over the last decade, and even more in the last 2 years, the severe divide of a half a millennium between Roman Catholics and Lutherans has now narrowed. And there are now commitments to seek greater unity between those two divided ways of understanding and living the Christian faith. As yet, this movement towards church unity hasn't had much political consequences. It's been a reformation within the sphere of religion craft or faith craft. But this reformation or realignment is in fact a sign of hope, since many doubted for centuries that it could happen at all. that after so many years and decades and centuries of disunity, of discord, and outright conflict and war, tens of thousands of lives lost on theological matters, some kind of harmony could emerge. So maybe the reformations might really be possible in the wider sphere of religion craft of faith, not just in Christianity. But maybe the Lutherans and Catholics are making it possible for others, other Christians and other persons of faith, to think about overcoming the divides that have lasted so long. And maybe that kind of reformation could even have, again, an impact on statecraft. Wouldn't it be wondrous, that is, if what might be achieved in the development of greater harmony in faithcraft could have a similar consequences in statecraft? It would be confirmation of what the German theologian Hans Küng, disowned by his own church, claimed when he said, "No peace among the nations without peace among the religions." I'll take issue with the rest of that quote later. But I believe he is correct about religion craft leading statecraft. There's a better chance for religions to get together than there is for states to get together who have been in serious conflict. And it would have tremendous implications on the use of what we call soft power rather than hard power to achieve civic or public purposes. Since most religions do fairly well with soft power, but they don't do well at all with hard power. The outstanding questions are, first, whether the reformations that are needed now in the 21st century, particularly in politics and religion, should follow the same strategies pursued in earlier periods of the 16th century, the 17th century, 15th and 16th and 17th century reformations. Secondly, that is, the first question is, do we follow the example, the pattern set in the Protestant Reformation? Second, whether we are condemned to the mixed results of that earlier period. And finally, whether we have time, like 500 years, to make this happen. I think you know the answer to that one. My answers to all three questions, by the way, are no. We must now do our reformations differently than before. We must find ways of avoiding downsides and maximizing upsides. And we must start doing it now. As a subset of the first question, I want to identify three things that I think we need to do differently than what Luther did and the other reformers did in the 16th century. And then to turn to avoiding pitfalls with the new ways of reforming, and then make an argument for doing it ASAP. One dimension of the question has to do with whether to follow earlier patterns of the Reformation or develop new ones. That centers on the relation between religion craft and statecraft, especially insofar as the state now refers to the nation state. In the Protestant Reformation, the way of relating to the secular political order took a different form by altering the relationship without making a fundamental change in the relationship of church and state. Rather than having a universal church, the Roman Catholic Church, relate interdependently with the political empire, the Holy Roman Empire, it chose in the Reformation to have sect-like parts of the church identify with particular emerging nation states. You see the parallel, but also the difference. The identifying, not with a universal church, but now particular religions divided, relating to a dividing empire. A divided faith with a divided empire, and a divided faith craft with a divided statecraft. that ended up with not just political and religious division, but ever since, religious and political wars. Yes, it is true that there were already cracks in the empire that the Reformation widened and made more permanent. But it is also the case that the Protestant Reformation contributed in its own way to the rise of the nation state and all the problems that are associated with the nation state. The fervent and deadly religious nationalism that grew out of that development, something we know about even in this country. And yes, although the American democratic doctrine of the independence of religion craft and statecraft had a growing appeal de jure, in principle, even in the United States there was a de facto established church for most of our history. The kind of reformation of statecraft and religion craft, that kind must not recur. The needed reformation of the two must allow for the ordering of the state to include the protection of religious minorities, for the diversity of religion. That's a part of statecraft now. And provision for religion to play both a prophetic and critical role over against the political entity, as well as freely taking constructive roles with the political entity. That's a matter of statecraft in relation to religion. That is primarily a reformation of statecraft that applies to all political entities, insofar as some kind of democratic polity is confessed and operated and is operative. But there is an equivalent reformation on the side of religion craft, based on both the recognition and appreciation of religious diversity on the part of religions themselves, and the need to develop strategies of growing inclusion among religions for shared insight, shared understanding, and yes, shared action. So it applies both for the statecraft and for the religion craft. This not identifying religion with politics, but allowing for diversity in both. Let's admit and acknowledge that these are not easy reformations for either statecraft or religion craft. Political entities by nature, it seems, want to privilege order over dynamism and change. It's the nature of the beast, the political beast, the kind of dynamism and change that the diversity of religions will likely bring. Religious entities, by nature it seems, want to claim exclusive access to the truth over against other religious entities, as well as political entities and other knowledge-seeking entities. And religions want to act on the basis of that exclusivity. Reformations in both statecraft and religion craft will not come easy. Not come easy in a world laden with nuclear armaments, and at present, the unequal distribution of essential resources for generative life for the Earth's inhabitants, human and non-human. What else must we do differently in the 21st century reformations than was done in the 16th century with reference to statecraft and religion craft? Here's one that follows from what I've just argued for, and that is, and it's just as difficult to achieve, to do with multiple sovereignties of knowledge, to contend with multiple sovereignties of knowledge and wisdom. I will be briefer here because I want to get to give fuller attention to a third difference between the 16th and 21st centuries in statecraft and religion craft. But this matter of multiple sovereignties of knowledge and wisdom is essential to what I would call shortly a reversal of starting points. In both statecraft and religion craft, there was in the 16th century the operating assumption that truth and wisdom had a single source, a single sovereignty, but disagreement about what that single source was to be. The division between Wittenberg and Rome had to do with the sovereignty of Scripture for Luther and the sovereignty of tradition for Rome. True, other sources of wisdom and knowledge had standing, but only in relation to what was held to be singularly sovereign. And that applied not just to religion craft, but to statecraft as well, in such terms as the divine right of kings, the priority of the papacy, infallibility of the Bible. To some degree, that still operates in our contemporary world, though some of the sovereignties have changed. The concept of tradition, for example, has, I think, helpfully widened so as not to locate it in a particular religion or political office, but in a recognition of the wisdom of the ancient cultures, indigenous cultures, that now must be paid attention to. This can be an enriched understanding of the wisdom of the ages if it isn't taken as the exclusive source. And much more relevantly, science in its various forms sometimes lays exclusive claims to truth. Unfortunately, because science has so much to provide us if it is in conversation with more cultural traditions. That is, there must be that universal and unending search for the truth, whether in religion or politics, accompanied by a recognition and provisions for multiple ways of seeking the truth. The seeking is always provisional and not so much negotiable as interactive and integrative and constructive. Now this leads to the third difference between the way reformations in statecraft and religion craft took place in the 16th century, and the way I believe they should occur in the 21st century. Well, not just the 16th century, but the way political and religious entities have operated for centuries. It has to do with what I mentioned earlier as starting points. Here I want to acknowledge my indebtedness to my friend and intellectual sparring partner, Bill Schweiker, the Edward Ryerson Distinguished Service Professor of Theological Ethics at the University of Chicago. In his presidential address to the Society of Christian Ethics in 2016 entitled Humanity and the Global Future, Bill set forth a concept that I found compelling. It's an appeal for what Schweiker calls theological humanism in religious, and in his case, Christian theological ethics. Keep in mind we're talking about starting points. The starting point is with humanity. He contends that this theological humanism is the most adequate ethical stance for respecting and enhancing the integrity of human and non-human life into the global future. Now, I can go into a little bit of where Bill comes from, but I'm going to skip that and simply suggest that his mentor, H. Richard Niebuhr, the brother of the famous Reinhold Niebuhr, Richard Niebuhr put forth the notion that an absolutely sovereign God made everything else relative. So that any concept of any doctrine itself was relative, but in its relativity also had a compelling consequence in the way doctrine influences ethics or behavior. So if you embraced, if you confessed a theological doctrine, it provided you the resources for making decisions about your human behavior or the behavior of those around you. What Schweiker is up to in his theological humanism is to reverse that process and to move not from doctrine to ethics or from doctrine to behavior, but to say we need to start with the issues that human beings are faced with today, right now, in their human life. And not just the privileged, not just the elite, but attention being given to those who are powerless. That's where theology ought to start, with how we address the ethical issues of injustice, inequality, violence, hatred, peace, the sustainability of the creation. If we start there, Bill wants to argue, we will have to contend with the fact that we are now engaged in what was once sacrosanct, that is, doctrine itself. That we need to, if we start with the human, and the human in its most wretched forms, we then have to contend with a reformed theology. So let me put this in my own words here in a historical reference. Put up with me here. Historically, religions have defined responsibility for their followers, what to do, according to the things that identified the religion's core beliefs. Religious ethics, that is, took form on the basis of what the particular religion taught with reference to religious truths about ultimate reality. Now, to be sure, in monocultural societies, this connection between identity and responsibility was seamless. You didn't have to think about it. Right? Virtually one and the same for the whole society. But over time, as the lived context became more religiously and culturally diverse, the believer, the practitioner of faith, became more self-conscious of what was responsible in faith-filled action, what was entailed by his or her self-declared religious identity. Identity shapes action. Some religions, or factions of religions, for example, could guide their self-identified followers on how to responsibly treat other human beings, how to relate to political entities, and how to treat the creation. While other religions or branches of religion could leave some or all of these issues unanswered, or even justify violence, inequality, and the exploitation of the earth. And beyond the phenomenon of diversity, the secularization of societies also contributed to the separation of religious identity from religious responsibility, or the weakening of deeply held religious beliefs and their ethical consequences, and the stronger adherence not to doctrine, but to secular societal norms and practices. The Bible or the denomination might treat and teach things about the dangers of wealth, for example. But in a society that's begun to separate doctrine from ethics, we get adherence to a doctrine of wealth accumulation, a doctrine of the goodness of consumption, the demonizing of political enemies, the normalizing of hate and violence in the media and political life. So a different way of grounding ethical behavior has already been taking place. If now religions are to contribute to meeting the critical problems of our time, they can no longer simply assume that religious identity will lead to responsibility, ethical responsibility. Instead, religions must insist that global responsibility must not only shape action, but shape religious identity. That our ethics now are the cause for us rethinking what we believe. That the reformed religious ethics should reform religious identity and thought, and in the end, the craft, the way we live our faith itself. The challenge then for religious communities around the world is to discover that within their own tradition that actually contributes to local and global problems, or allows them to continue unabated, to discover and reclaim those elements within their traditions that motivate believers to be constructively responsive to challenges, and to reform their traditions to the new reality of both religioncraft and statecraft, which I believe also means that they will be attentive not just to their scriptures, but other forms of revelation, including scientific and cultural and political wisdom. If Schweiker is correct on this of our situation and how to address it, and I tend to believe that Bill is right, then the second and third questions I raised earlier can be addressed. Can we, as people of not just different religions and different political entities, but also people who share a world of interdependent parts and a shared earthly home, can we accomplish our reformations of religioncraft and statecraft in ways that maximize the upside of change and avoid the downside of change? Can we? That is, are we able to do that? Maximize the positive? Minimize the downside? I believe we can. It is possible to avoid many of the mistakes of the earlier Reformation in statecraft and religioncraft. Reforming the relations between political and religious entities that allows for diversity, encourages inclusion, that takes account of the ways a reformed religioncraft can effectively play both a prophetic and a constructive role in statecraft, that honors multiple sources of knowledge and wisdom, and makes provisions for shared sovereignties of the search for truth. All of that is possible. Can we? Yes. Will we? I have my doubts. Why? Because of our resistance to reformation in statecraft and religioncraft, our built-in resistance to change. Might be a way you can use a political slogan, but when it gets down to it, we're very resistant as human beings to change. We seem to be able to pull off small reformations, but strike a stance of resistance to fundamental change, even when we are told that delaying significant reformations is an invitation for revolutions by those without power against those who currently have it. It is then the question not of capacity or an ability to engage in fundamental forms of statecraft and religioncraft, but our openness and our willingness to put the necessary reformations into place and to do so without delay. I can think of no other way of powerfully gaining this openness and willingness to fundamental change than to make it abundantly clear by the facts of the matter why now is the time. Luther pulled it off with his effective use of the printing press and putting his vision and program of reform in the vernacular of the people. People can understand it. Why can't we do that in multiples with the amazing modern modes of worldwide and accessible communication? It isn't that the threats are unknown and untold. Just this past week, the New York Times ran an article on the front page of its business section entitled, "In Forsaking World's Poor, U.S. Risk Rise in Conflicts." Here's the opening paragraph. Since the end of World War II, American foreign policy has understood the role of economic development in the prevention of conflicts around the world, providing a subtle yet powerful contribution to the United States' own national security. The article continues, paragraph 2. Poverty reduces the opportunity cost of violence. Scarcity intensifies competition over resources. Inequality pits have-nots against haves. And poor states are weaker, less able to contain conflict once it breaks out. John F. Kennedy summed up the argument more than a half-century ago. A more prosperous world would also be a more secure world. And the article continues, President Trump isn't buying it. And then the article details how a different reformation in statecraft is occurring right before our very eyes. It's taking hold, one that substitutes increased armaments at the expense of poverty reduction and economic development. Many generals and admirals disagree, but to no avail. In testimony before the Senate Armed Service Committee last month, a group of military leaders said, quote, American security is undermined by frail and falling nations where hope is non-existent and where conditions foster radicalism, produce refugees, spark insurgencies, provide safe havens for terrorists, criminal gangs, and human traffickers. That's what the result of a changed statecraft that we heard a little about in opposition. Development assistance, they said, isn't charity. It's an essential modern tool of U.S. national security. And budget numbers tell the story. $52 billion increase in the Pentagon's budget for next year. $26 billion cut for diplomacy and foreign aid, which is a 28% reduction from last year. And the article proceeds to roll out fact upon fact, study upon study about the current exercise in statecraft. Now the questions. How many sermons yesterday had their starting point with that information? How many religiously oriented TV programs highlighted these facts? How many Facebook and Twitter entries from people of faith called attention to this article, pointed out how it ran counter to the teaching of religious traditions? How many national and global religious organizations announced a concerted effort to lobby the president and the Congress against the proposed budget, or rose up to challenge his highest priority, America first? How many? Where, in other words, was the religion craft in this new phase of statecraft? Where was the soft power of faith communities working together across the historic divisions of faith being now put in place? Where was the religious ethics providing the starting point for us reassessing and realigning religious identity and religious doctrine? Same question should be raised regularly about the rising threat of radical and virulent nationalism across the globe, about the raging violence in our cities across the world, about the plight of refugees caused by war and dislocation of populations because of famine. That is the starting point for ethics that will lead to a change in religious doctrine, to religious belief. And then there is the massive issue of climate change, a threat literally that places the fate of the earth in peril. In that same issue of the New York Times last week, I do read it daily. I just got caught on Wednesdays. There was an article on biological annihilation that is now already underway. 30% of all land vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, are experiencing declines and in local population losses. In most parts of the world, mammal populations are losing 70% of their members in habitat losses. 70%. And we as human mammals are not alarmed by that? Really? We as people of faith are not concerned about the task of reforming our religion craft and exercising whatever power we have to influencing statecraft at home and abroad? Why now for the religion craft to begin? Really now? Can that be a serious question? The question can't be whether we start the reformation of religion craft, but what to start with. Let me conclude by suggesting what should be at the top of our reforming religion craft list. You already know that I believe what I believe is a first principle, and in a sense, the way Luther led here. Luther's conscience was stirred by what he sensed was awry in his world, what we today might call the commercialization of salvation. It was the selling of those indulgences that made him so damn mad. That violation of ethics led him to look at his Christian identity and the doctrines at the core of religious identity. And there he found the grounds for action in a re-understanding of doctrine. That there was a violation of what constituted the good in Scripture. He did not act irrationally. He did not act without studying the issue. But he did act. Something like that ought to provoke our own reformations with our religion craft. Ready to be pricked in our conscience. A predisposition to think deeply about the nature of what has gone awry in our world. A willingness to act and to use every possible means to enlist others in the reformation. Every one of us has that responsibility. Moving from ethics to thought and then back to action in concert together with others. I'm prejudiced on the second movement in religious reformation today, and it's different than Luther's. I believe that today we have the ethical obligation, given the seriousness of the sins stacked against us, to find collaborators in the effort to correct what is wrong. Now, it's acceptable, I suppose, to confine one's reforming actions to one's own religious tradition. But if we're really serious about injustice and violence and ecological destruction, I believe we've got to find other people in other traditions who are disturbed by what we see is happening. To join forces with those others to make things right. In my own work, that's the power, the soft power of the interfaith movement. Not acting alone in our own tradition, but coming together with others. Earlier I said that I agreed with Hans Kung about there being no peace among the nations without peace among the religions. But I disagree with his next two claims, that there will be no peace among the religions without dialogue between the religions, and no dialogue between religions without investigation of the foundations of religions. I once thought King Kung was right. I've changed my mind. I think religions can work together without dialogue about what they believe and the foundations for those beliefs. I don't think it's necessary for concerted action. I'm fairly sure that shared action will lead to dialogue about beliefs and the foundation of beliefs. I think that will happen. But I don't think we need to wait for that in order to act together. In short, I'm much more in favor of inclusivity among diversity, especially when that inclusivity leads to shared action for the common good. I'm much more committed to that than I'm achieving any sense of unity for unity's sake. I couldn't care less, even though I think it'll emerge from that concerted action. This cosmopolitan commitment does not mean that anyone gives up other identities. But it does mean that all of my other identities are qualified by my commitment and loyalty to the inclusive global community of which I'm a part. That is, I think we need a renewed movement, a new movement, almost artistic movement, of a sense of what it means to be a global citizen. Not that I can't also be an American, but my Americanism will be shaped by what I understand to be my global citizenship. Not the other way around. And that in turn requires that I do my utmost to follow a global ethic In the late 1980s, Hans Kung began his work of outlining and developing such a global ethic, which was adopted by the Parliament of the World's Religion in 1993. There's always, I know, room for improvement, but I continue to try to adhere to the 4 irrevocable directives of that global ethic, which I now commend to you. First, a commitment on our part to a culture of nonviolence and respect for life. An irrevocable ethic. Second, a commitment to a culture of solidarity and a just economic order. Third, a commitment to a culture of tolerance and a life of truthfulness. Fourth, a commitment to a culture of equal rights and partnership between men and women. To my mind, in my heart and soul, those are the irrevocable directives upon which a reformation of statecraft and religion can be built for our generation and for our children's generation and our great-grandchildren's generation. Let's begin it now. Thank you.
Dr. Larry Greenfield, we thank you. You've introduced this, I think, very creative concept of religion craft, generated by a spirit of self-criticism and reform, into what will be, I think, a thick and challenging discussion this week on geopolitics, and we're most grateful to you. You also represent an extraordinary organization, the Parliament of World Religions, and essentially the biggest tent of interfaith in the world. So I look forward to those who will come now to pose questions or offer very brief comments to you. They will line up at the 2 microphones on either side of the podium. And Larry, we ask you to come and to acknowledge them in alternating order. Here they are.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name.
I don't usually turn to the right, but
You are very correct about that. Okay. I love and appreciated several of the comments call for reform with every possible means, where we need ethical obligation as being the leading force to be acting in concert. And you talk about a new movement where we're global citizens. But I'm looking to about your thoughts about the next logical step as we take on this, what I hope it becomes a strong force. That would it not be reasonable for me to suggest that this would include full acceptance of the validity of secular humanism, along with theological humanism, where there's a dialogue, where there's a community, where there's the acceptance of all that we agree upon, would be the greatest force, the most powerful force for accomplishing what you said is 5 or 6 things that I know that we all accept as goals for the American citizen.
the answer is yes. No, I think there's ways in which...
May I ask then, I think the means by which we can accomplish that, I think, is what I'm really looking for. So,
Well, I think there are a number of secular humanists, atheists, and so on, that are as concerned as I am. I have no special status because of my religion to address issues of the sustainability of the earth. So I think what I'm trying to say is doctrine can't be the first step in addressing the issue. It is a kind of it is the wide openness of what Schweiker called theological humanism. That can take many forms. Then, I happen to be a complete naturalist myself. I can't get my head around the notion of the supernatural. But that doesn't mean that I can't work with supernaturalists. and addressing poverty, and addressing crime, and addressing issues of sustainability. So yes, by all means, that next step needs to be taken to embrace. My principle here in the talk was inclusivity. And let me just give you, we're working on the 2017 Parliament, which will be held in November in Toronto, small plug. We worked with a possible theme of the promise of diversity, the power of love. And we talked to a bunch of young people, and they said, no. Diversity means it's a condition. Lots of differences. But it doesn't mean that you work together. Inclusiveness is what you want. This was my granddaughter speaking. Grandpa, what you want is the term inclusive, where everybody's at the table, wherever the doctrines are laid out. It is a concerted action. That's what's required. We can have those discussions about doctrine, but maybe after the day's work of seeking justice is completed. Over here.
Hi. I want to start by saying, listen to your granddaughter. You can learn a lot. My name is Leonard Pelletieri. I'm an educational psychologist from San Diego. A few months ago, I spoke to the local PBS in San Diego and suggested I would like to do a film on mindfulness. And they enthusiastically encouraged me, and I'm hoping to get this film out within a year. Mindfulness is what you might call our collaborator. I mean, for centuries, science and religion have been sort of pushing against each other. And along in the 21st century comes machinery, science, neuroscience, MRI machines to show that certain things that we don't want to call it meditation because that sounds religious, and of course we know we can't teach religion in the schools. But if you leave out the foreign words and just do mindfulness, which is, among other things, meditation and yoga, and maybe even farming. A lot of elementary schools are getting into farming because you have to feed your brain, literally, good stuff if you want to have a good, healthy brain. I don't want to go on I really would like to go on for an hour, but I won't. Let's accept that this is a new great thing, a new collaborator with us. Science is making your granddaughter the good person you want her to be. Yeah. Do you agree? Where do we go from here? How do we encourage the public schools to accept this?
Yes.
There have been some, it's already happening. Go home, do a little research on your computer. Your local university knows what I'm talking about.
Yep.
And where it has been tried.
The point for me,
there's been resistance.
The point for me here is,
Move on. We've had the question.
Well, I want to say that, there is some resistance to people who say,
oh, I understand.
This is
but
religion.
a major
not.
problem we've got is the problem of being distracted. And what mindfulness and consciousness, in a disciplined way, in a craft way, the craft of mindfulness, the craft of consciousness, is a way of a disciplined avoidance of distraction. And it seems to me that that is a practice of faith, a religious practice, that we ought to cultivate. So thank you. Over here.
So thanks for your talk this afternoon, Larry. My name is Ravi Shankar. My question is actually, you talked about, you challenged the question, where were the senators and congressmen when, they're cutting back on money for statecraft, et cetera. So where do you see good examples of either religious leaders working towards the goals you're suggesting or political leaders who are actually working towards the goals that you're hoping for?
I see it most directly in the ecological movement, where I think those who have been mindful of what is happening are concerned about the loss of hope. And as Studs Terkel says, if you've lost hope, you've lost everything. So I'm interested in identifying those people, and I see those people who are taking concrete steps not to recreate the world that I grew up in, but are committed for the cause of hope to prepare children for a different world than I lived in, which will be which may be a less prosperous world in terms of my family, but it will be a more just world for the families of the earth. That's where I see it primarily in the ecological movement. I live in Chicago, a city full of crime. And it isn't distraction, it's a sense of powerlessness to bring about change. So that's a part of it too, that why aren't we fighting these evils on multiple fronts? So thanks.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for enunciating those principles, uplifting principles at the end of your talk. But problem I see, let me just illustrate it. Last week, there was a journalist who covers the evangelical movement, and what she pointed out is even though many prominent evangelical leaders, opposed some of Trump's principles and values, the vast majority of evangelicals voted for Trump anyway. So, where is the leadership versus where is the flock? And has the flock basically burnt its bridges and made a Faustian bargain? They don't believe in these principles anymore. They think they need to do something much more cynical to get what they want. Is that the crisis we're facing?
Thank you. Thank you. Now I can go to my left. So thanks for the testimony. It's that sort of action. It's that sort of action that I think is required. Yes, thank you.
My name is Carol Tyler.
Hi, Carol.
And recrafting things, it seems to me we have to let go of things. And it seems to me that the people who are still left fighting to reform the states, the religions that have shaped our lives, need to let go.
Yeah.
What words of wisdom do you have about what we should let go of and who should step aside?
Well, I think there are some very, very practical things that we can let go of. I was at a conference on Star Island off the coast of New Hampshire a couple weeks ago, and it was on the issue of climate change and what we have to do politically, community-wise, and what we have to do individually. And at one point, one of the speakers said, well, what we have to do individually is give up meat.
Big time.
And people said, well, I mean, completely? And the speaker said, no. Start with one meal a week without meat. See if you can go to 2. Get rid of, And the response was, I'm sorry, I can't do that.
Yeah, right.
That we were so habituated to a certain kind of diet. And I suspect we are habituated to a certain kind of attention to a television program, that we are unwilling to make sacrifices on behalf of what we know we must do in order for the changes to occur. So I think that the whole religious tradition of giving up has to have a renewal. My wife will swallow hard, and I will get a lecture on the way home about giving up CDs and books.
Okay.
She says there is such a thing as a public library. But I appreciate your point. I think we, along with not being distracted, having a sense of consciousness and mindfulness, there also be an accompanying way in which we lose weight, lose immoral weight in the face of the crisis that the globe faces.
And I'm going to have to confess, find a place to confess that the truth that I know is better than everybody else's truth. I'm going to have to give some of that up and make room for other people's truth.
I can help you with that.
Question on the right.
Oh, I'm question right.
I have a question about, talk about reforming religion craft and statecraft, and it seems like they could really help each other out, but keeping the defined separation of church and state at the same time. Is that kind of tough, or that kind of work itself out, or if you
Say the last part again.
just a defined separation of church and state at the same time? They're both kind of maybe reforming and helping each other out, state and religion craft, while keeping the separation of church and state.
Yeah, the separation language is unfortunate, I think.
Be more like
The statecraft, according to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the statecraft has to do with what the state does in order to protect religious freedom and the avoidance of an established church. It doesn't make statements about what religions are prohibited from doing in terms of their involvement in the state.
Right.
Now, we have done some things legislatively and administratively to address that issue and the current issue, of course, is whether there can be the endorsement of political candidates from the pulpit. That's a really a thorny one. But I think the issue of how the state guarantees the practice of religion among minorities is one that can't be limited only to our own country. We have to be involved in it on a global scale.
Right. And what percent globally do you think that is our, like how, where we have that?
Yeah, I don't know the percentage. And don't ask me for particulars because I want to get out of here alive.
Okay. On the whole, you talked just briefly about science. It seems to me it's gotten worse, the religion versus science over the times. You said, how the Catholic and the Protestant has kind of come closer together. Can the religion and science come kind of closer back together?
Yeah, I think they can. I'm working on a number of projects.
Climate change is definite.
Here's one place where we're working together, for example. We're trying to put together anthropologists and biologists and people who study the oceans together to share so that there is cross-fertilization in the scientific community of what we're learning about dead parts of the ocean and the erosion of arable land and so on. But at the same time, bringing religious leaders and thinkers together to get clear where they stand on those sorts of issues or where they need help. And then finding ways in which we can bring those two communities together to talk sense about how we communicate effectively with our scientific colleagues and with our religious communities.
Start with the
Final three questions.
low-hanging fruit first,
Sir,
kind
I'm
of.
sorry, you've had your
the
question.
easy
Thanks.
Did that answer the question?
Yeah.
Hi.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to welcoming you into Toronto for the World Parliament next year.
terrific.
That'll be awesome. Unfortunately, by then I probably will no longer be a clergy person in the United Church of Canada, as I will probably by then no longer be a clergy person in the United Church of Canada. I'm expecting to be stripped of my credentials in November at a hearing due to doctrinal incongruency, we will call it that. And I'm wondering if denominations, we heard last week considerable commentary about the shift of Christian dominance and the dwindling of most denominational Christian realities. And so as people like me who see the gospel as calling us to believe that how we live is more important than what we believe, and so as our beliefs shift and change, we are still called to that gospel. how do we make that shift from when our denominations are under siege, we feel we're losing things, we want to retrench, and we pull our resources in rather than sending them out. And as I've watched over the course of last week, I've seen individuals afraid of losing their denomination. Yet this is a generation that has such capital resources in terms of human knowledge to share with those people who no longer believe or never did. The vast growing group of nuns who in community may be able to engage, and we could transfer our social capital from religion to them. How do we untangle those fingers so that those who have that social capital can offer it to a new generation without being kicked out of the church?
Yeah. Honestly, don't know. I think it's a puzzling issue of why it takes such effort to exercise the discipline of love. When it is so deeply entrenched in all these religious traditions, and yet there is resistance to it, and we can see the numerical consequences of not embracing it.
Mm-hmm.
What's the matter with us?
You didn't
Now-
express much hope that we'd be able to do that, but I thought there might be something else we could do.
I'm told
Yeah, I know. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Apologize coming to you from the right. Two-part question.
You can redeem yourself with a good question.
Short question.
I would like for you to flesh out a little bit more about the starting point with the doctrine pushed aside, and then secondly, if we don't do this, it's very obvious it's time for reform.
Say it again. Say the last part again. Did you get?
If we don't start this reform, then what? Because it's very obvious we need it.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little in the minority by saying that I think we have already passed a tipping point, and that in terms of sustainability issues, and therefore we ought not to, that point about not recreating the world that we lived in, but now helping our children live in a very different world. How do we do that? I think it has to do with the multiple sovereignties of knowledge and wisdom, of sources of wisdom and knowledge that can come together and say, how can we figure this out? How can we figure out a future, not like ours, the one world we experience, but living in a world that is much different. That's the best I can do.
Final question.
I'm Doug Asbury from Riverside, Illinois.
Hey.
And I'm wondering, thinking about Jonathan Haidt's work on our choosing to believe what we are intuiting and not to believe what we don't. And I'm wondering if we're not in perhaps what I'd call a neo-messianic age, where people are looking for the leader who will set things right. And whether it's a Hillary Clinton or a Bernie Sanders or a Donald Trump or whoever, that we're still looking for somebody else to do the things that we want to avoid doing, the deep thinking, the collaboration across dividing lines and that kind of thing. And is it possible that we can move beyond the messianic thinking to actually beginning to take responsibility ourselves?
It's a great question. My thought is that one of the other disciplines that we need to cultivate is the cultivate of listening to those people who are so full of despair And in part, they are full of despair because they haven't been listened to. We haven't appreciated their condition. And so I think it's incumbent upon those of us who are, whatever stance we take towards God, I don't know, supernatural, a naturalist like me, doesn't make any difference. The question is, can we open our ears to those who suffer and give them the kind of collaboration that will move them out of that messianism and into community. That's where it seems to me we have to go.
Thank you.